Thank you. So my name's David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's great to have you here. There's some faces I don't see every week. It's a lot of change one week to another, so that's not totally unusual. But could I ask for a show of hands for people that either consider themselves students of history, or at least history is a big passion? Show of hands. Great. Yeah, so that's one of the things we were hoping for today, and I see we're going to have some more historians enter the room. How are you, Liam? The Mitchell Center is a kind of a gathering place that I think should exist on every university campus in the world, and I'm actually going to Michigan in a couple weeks to help make that happen. Sort of a grassroots effort of folks from around the world trying to do this. But some people think about our work on sustainability as kind of like STEM stuff. If you know what STEM is, you know, science, engineering, math, and technology things. But really, the role of the humanities in this work is enormously important. There's a bunch of moral, ethical, and spiritual dimensions to what kind of future we want to create on the planet, and obviously the role of history, not that I'm a historian by a long shot, although Senator Mitchell, had he not gone on to do whatever you call becoming the Senate Majority Leader and a few other things, he definitely would have been a professor of European history. So just a little known fact, that's what he was likely to become if he hadn't stumbled into the world of the political world. But having historians help scientists and other scholars and researchers and communities think about these problems is incredibly important, both to understand what's happened in the past, to think about what it means for the present and the future. By the way, this isn't the first time we've had a history talk here. A number of them, including 2 or 3 already by Dick Judd, who right now I think is out in Santa Cruz. But the last thing he said to me before he headed out was, can I come give a talk about my new work on land trusts in Maine? So we'll get him back in here in a while. So you see some things going by here, and the one I wanted to mention is next week we have a wonderful researcher, Spencer Meyer, coming to give a talk, Conservation Not Just for Do-Gooders. If you Google that title and the Mitchell Center, you'll find a great story about him. He actually did his PhD here. He worked with a bunch of people in the School of Forest Resources and on a big project in the Mitchell Center about sustainability. So he'll be here. There's a thing going by, so that's Spencer and Michelle Johnson, who worked together. Both of them did their PhDs. And then there's also something going by about lightning talks for students. If you're a graduate student or an undergraduate doing anything interesting in the sustainability realm, and trust me, that's a really big tent, please get in touch with me or Ruth Hallsworth pretty quick, because we'd like to get you signed up to do this. It's real low-key, but it's quite fun because it's a fun mix of different people talking about their work, and we still have a few open slots. Mentioned that Dick would like to give a talk. Brian Payne will be here from Bridgewater State University in a joint History Mitchell Center talk in the spring. Micah Pauling in the back, I think I've twisted his arms enough that he's probably agreed to give a talk next fall when he's back. So let me just go into, it's a pleasure to have Mark McLaughlin here today. The minute I knew anything about him, I realized how wonderful it would be to have him come talk here. So his PhD is from the University of New Brunswick in history, and he's now an assistant professor of history and Canadian studies at the University of Maine. I've done a lot of wonderful work on forestry and natural resource management and forests as contested spaces, as you'll both hear about in his talk, and all you have to do is look around in Maine and see that that situation is still true, maybe more often than we would like. He's got a wonderful book that I don't quite know its current status, called Trees or a Crop, that in progress, that I'm sure he'll be talking about pieces of that. I just wanted to say there's some really interesting connections between the work he's done and how we got involved in our sustainability work that probably not everybody would know about. The first is that a lot of this work that he's done includes the Crown Forests of New Brunswick, and the fact that if you haven't heard about the spruce budworm, trust me, when it erupts and decimates these forests, you'll be aware of it. And back in the 50s and 60s, when they were aerial spraying all over the place for pesticides, this led to quite a bit of controversy, as he will discuss. Well, at the same time as that was going on, a relatively young researcher named Buzz Halling was doing his PhD on spruce budworm dynamics. Pauling was the guy who gave rise to a major concept in sustainability called resilience. And that has deeply shaped the work of sustainability scientists all over the world. Moreover, one of Buzz Holling's students, Bill Clark, who's at Harvard's Kennedy School, is one of the people who created, with Bob Cates, who was on our advisory board, the field of sustainability science. So there's funny connections between all of these histories that are really exciting. I just wanted to say there's personal connections for me. When I got to know a little bit about Mark, I realized he'd gotten this prestigious Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellowship at Trent University with a guy named Stephen Bakke, an environmental historian. Well, the book I've read about 3 times, and almost every page as I looked at it has scribbles on it because I was so amazed by what this guy was talking about. That's who he worked with for his postdoc. And so this work I read right before I came to the University of Maine about 12 years ago. The most interesting and kind of disturbing line in the whole book is this one. He says, "How can science be so important yet so ineffective in environmental affairs?" And I have to say I took this really personally because I became an environmental scientist thinking it was going to be really useful. And believe me, if you pick up this book and read it, whether you read it back in 2004, which is the first time I read it, or I picked it up a couple weeks ago and I thought, man, this stuff is just as relevant today, it's not by any means guaranteed that environmental science or the sciences more broadly are going to get us out of this mess. So hopefully we'll learn some stuff from Mark about his views of that. But also, you may not know that he's also interested in eco-comics, and I gather he's going to fold that into his talk today. And so obviously everybody in their office has an eco-comic on the shelf, so I pulled mine off. This is Captain Ecology, Pollution Fighter. So obviously, for me, this is a real thrill to have Mark here. Please join me in welcoming him.
Great. I finished my PhD in the fall of 2013, and then I was postdoc for a couple of years, and I started here at UMaine in January of 2016. So I've been kind of a proven academic for a little while now, but it's always nice to see that there are people out there who are interested in hearing about your research. So what we do as historians, we're often alone a lot of the time. So when you have opportunities to come out and share our research with others, particularly grad students and interested people, it's a great opportunity. I'd like to thank David and Ruth and the Mitchell Center for inviting me here today. I'd like to see more of these sorts of connections between our department and the center moving forward. I think it'd be great. I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other. In a smaller university like UMaine, I think we do need to do as much of this sort of interdisciplinarity stuff as we can. So I'm an environmental historian. So before I kind of get into my talk today, I thought I should probably give a bit of an introduction. First of all, to kind of qualify and place myself as a researcher and as an individual for everyone in the room, but also to give you a sense of what environmental history is, and then also give you a little bit of an overview about where my research comes from and how I approach it as an environmental historian. And then I want to get into what I refer to as structural barriers that people have often encountered in the past and also today when they're trying to engage with, say, policymakers, government officials on environmental topics. And this is not any sort of conclusive list. There's all kinds of these sorts of issues that can arise. But today, I'm a bit of a structuralist, a bit of a structural historian. So I'm going to be focusing on economic, political, and social, particularly the economic and political side of things. I'm going to talk a fair amount about a case study from my work, New Brunswick spruce bedroom spraying program from the 1950s and 1970s. What's the issue? What's going on? The ways in which the nascent environmental movement in New Brunswick tried to engage with government officials in the 1970s in particular, why it was so difficult to try to get their attention, and what finally kind of tipped the issue. And then at the end, I'd like to offer a few general conclusions if possible. Unlike maybe some of the social scientists, historians, we are very nervous about being predictive and kind of shooting ourselves into the present or into the future. But I know that this is a Center for Sustainability Solutions. So what I would like to try to do today is offer a few takeaways for the students here so that maybe you can learn a little something from it. At the very least, hopefully I can tell you a few stories that you'll think is kind of interesting when you're having a beer or a coffee later on. So I'm from New Brunswick. This is the great province in Canada, right next door to Maine. I'm from up in that general area, up near Grand Falls, sort of across from the Caribou area. I'm also going to be talking a little bit today about a fair amount about the Crown lands, if not specifically, then kind of indirectly. And they're generally placed kind of up here in sort of the northern part of the province, but in particular, sort of north central. Not many people living up in those general areas, and those are sort of historically where a lot of the sort of harvesting in New Brunswick's forestry sector has been done. I grew up on a very small family potato farm. My father was a farmer for a little over 30 years, retired about 2003, so he's been retired for a little while now. And the sort of harvesting that you're seeing here in terms of using potato pickers, using sort of a very old-fashioned method, that's the sort of method that he used right up until the day that he retired. And he started farming in 1971, and for a period of 2 or 3 years in the mid-70s or so, he did use rather large harvesters. But what he found, at least for harvesters from back then, is that they really compacted the soil, kind of made it so there wasn't much oxygen in the soil still. There was also concerns about the effects on bruising potatoes and that sort of thing. Now, I think they're better now, but I think if he was still harvesting to this day, he'd probably still be using the hand pickers, because for him, he thought there was a better product in the end, but there was also less impact on the land itself. This is a big thing that my parents always sort of try to imbue in me and my brothers, is this idea of land stewardship, environmental stewardship, if you will. And you know, being an obnoxious teenager, I didn't always appreciate the lessons that they were trying to teach me, but this is the sort of thing that was always in the background. So as I did move on to college, grad school, and those sorts of things, when I encountered environmental history, it's a long and complicated process, this was the sort of, kind of spoke to me, if you will. So what is environmental history? Most historians, or a lot of the time what we've done in the past, a lot of history was kind of human-to-human relationships, and the sort of human society, human structures, if you will. But about the 1960s, 70s, a certain kind of small group of historians, particularly in the western US, started asking the question, where is nature involved in all of this? What about environmental landscapes, ecological landscapes? So the environment, or nature itself as a historical actor, started to be sort of tied in to the study of history. And since then, it's become more of a thing, if you will, in places in like the US and Australia. And there were a number of environmental historians in Canada throughout the 80s and 90s, but in particular, environmental history in Canada exploded about 2004 with the founding of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This is a network of people who do environmental history in Canada. And I was a member of that sort of first generation of grad students that came up when Niche was founded back in the mid-2000s. And those people who started at that point in time, a lot of us are now entrenched within various sort of university departments throughout North America and much of the world. If you're interested in what we do, Network in Canadian History and Environment is still around. That's our website, nichecanada.org. We've got a great blog where we try to make history fun for the masses. And for my own work, I look at the history of forestry in New Brunswick, and in particularly focused on the mid-20th century. But some of you may know, perhaps you don't, forestry and the forest industries in New Brunswick really started as sort of on an intensive and commercial scale around the turn of the 19th century. Now, it's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples had lived in the area for thousands of years and had very sort of intense relationships with their local environments. The sort of large-scale harvesting of logs and using them commercially, as we understand it today, started about 1800 or so in New Brunswick. At first, it was ship masts for the Royal Navy. Later, it was square timber in sort of the first half of the 19th century. And as we get further along into the 19th century, near the end, we start getting into the lumber industry. And this is sort of indicative of the type of harvesting that was done much of the time. It was very seasonal, and cutting was done during the winter because it was easier to move the logs when there was snow on the ground. And it was sort of done by the energy of humans and animals, right? And here's a great photo I just found when I was doing some research in New Brunswick a few weeks ago, late August. And a lot of the time, the lumber mills that popped up by mid to late 19th century, a lot of them were smaller like this, sort of more had community tie-ins. It's not to say they didn't have vast environmental impacts, they did, but what I want to show you in a second, I think means something different once pulp and paper comes in. Now this is this is really neat because it's got, you see the houses are very close by. This is probably a smaller family mill. And there would have been other lumber mills that would have employed 200 or 300 men. So this is just to give you an idea of what it looked like. By the early 20th century, particularly after about 1920, when international lumber markets plummet after World War I, you see more of these sorts of lumber mills. These are portable sawmills that can move from place to place. So rather than waiting for the product, the logs to come to you, you move to them. These were often blamed for a lot of environmental degradation by the larger companies, but more often than not, the larger companies just considered them a nuisance. They were in the way of getting their own wood. By the 1920s and 1930s, the era of pulp and paper had really come to New Brunswick for various reasons I'm not going to get into today. But I think what's really neat about this photo is that it really kind of helps to show some of the scale of what pulp and paper is actually like. And this also reminds me that when I look at these sorts of photos, or when I looked at them in August, it reminded me that these aren't just photos for a book. These are actual photographic evidence, right? Something powerful about the image on the screen, showing us the scale of the types of things that not necessarily words can always get across. This is the Irving Pulp and Paper Mill in St. John, New Brunswick, about late 1940s. And as you can see, there's a massive wood drive that would have happened going down the St. John River, a massive pile of pulpwood at the back. So there's a certain scale that's occurring here that I think is very important to acknowledge. Not only is it the scale, it's the whereas before you were maybe a little more discerning with the type of lumber that you would cut, when you have pulp and paper, they just grind it all down and throw it in, right? So there's also a massive cutting of the forest that were occurring on a scale perhaps that had never happened before. And there are certain sorts of backup components, things like the spruce budworm spraying program that industrial forestry involves, that lumber doesn't necessarily. When we're talking about the impacts of pulp and paper that I'm interested in, this is another good photo, I think, to give you a sense of this scale. Luckily, for us, and for me in particular, a worker happened to walk by when they were taking this photograph. And it gives you a real sense of how large these piles of pulpwood at individual mills could be. This is Bathurst Pulp and Paper up in northeastern New Brunswick. Kind of in the northeast of the province, if you don't exactly know where that is. And luckily enough, they took a photo on the same day, and they did it from the side. And again, it's the scale of it. This is the same conveyor belt that we saw beforehand. These are 8-foot pieces of pulp. These individual piles are multiple stories high. I can't really tell you how high they actually are, but there are massive piles going all the way back into the background that you really can't see anymore. So I'm really interested in terms of understanding what's the environmental impact that comes with that. How do people who, besides the pulp and paper companies, want to access the public or crown forests, which I should note make up about 50% of the province, the other half is privately owned. How do these different people come together, negotiate access to public forests, and often the provincial government or the state as a mediator between all these interests that want to gain access. So, few of the barriers that I want to talk about today, just to give you a sense about how big the industry finally does get. By the early 1970s, there were 10 pretty good-sized pulp and paper mills throughout New Brunswick. 11 owned by 10 different companies, strategically placed throughout various points throughout the province. So for a place about the size of Maine, this is quite a large industrial operation that's ongoing. Now, some of the structural barriers that people encountered when concerns about the environmental impact of the pulp and paper industry were starting to be expressed. For example, you start to see people voicing concerns to the federal and provincial authorities as early as the 1930s about sort of the effects of mill effluents in bodies of water around the province. And a lot of the first people who are speaking about these sorts of issues are fishermen, because they're concerned about the fish who are also in the water with these effluents. So these sorts of concerns are being voiced fairly early on, a number of decades before the 60s and 70s, when we think of the rise of the modern environmental movement. And one of the sort of first barriers I kind of want to focus on today is an economic barrier. And it's important to acknowledge the degree to which the forest industries themselves are the economic backbone, historically, of New Brunswick. Except for maybe British Columbia, there's no other province in Canada that politics, economics, society in general, kind of revolve around the highs and lows of forestry over a couple 100-year period. Now, forestry isn't quite as central as it once was, but even well into the 1980s or so, forestry played a key role, particularly in rural parts of the province. I have a colleague of mine that, when he's talking about Newfoundland and the way that fishing has shaped that province, he likes to say that no one is going to do anything in rural Newfoundland except for fish, right? That is sort of the economic backbone of the outports of rural Newfoundland. Maybe with some oil, who knows? Very sort of similar situation occurs in New Brunswick. A lot of the sort of rural economic backbone, except for agriculture, is forestry. So when people are starting to talk about, putting in sort of certain regulations, trying to get the different mills to clean up their practices, there's very deep concerns that people have about what sort of economic spin-offs that might have, right? So there's a sort of economic barrier that's in place. What's deeply tied in with that sort of economic barrier is the idea of the political barrier. And as you might see up here on the screen, there's a term called the client state. The idea of the client state is not necessarily particularly complicated, but it's very useful for us here today, used by historians, political economists, and others, to try to get at the idea of the sort of relationship that can occur between government and industry, particularly in economically marginal areas, places that might be considered poorer parts of the country, if you will. In Canada, they have a term called the have-not provinces, the parts of the country, the provinces that are poorer than the rest, supposedly. And this relationship, referring to the client state, it's the degree to which the provincial government becomes sort of tied in with and reliant upon the major industry players, right? So this can happen in various ways. Most obvious is that the resource revenues that a particular government will get from giving access to the Crown Forests become very important in terms of funding the sorts of services that governments are supposed to do. So then if there's anything coming along, like say environmental regulations or the sort, that might affect that and affect economic growth, then there's very much a concern that that's then going to pull away from those available resources that you then need to run the operations of the state. But then there's also a very sort of, selfish reason perhaps that politicians can have. If things go bad in a rural area and the local economy isn't doing great, voters take that out on you, right? So there's a sort of self-survival type thing there as well. And I should note that in my own work, that this sort of relationship that occurs in terms of this idea of the client state, I kind of give it a period from 1960 to 1980, where the sort of resource sharing and financial agreements between the federal and provincial governments change enough that there's some fiscal space for the province of New Brunswick to be quite imaginative with forestry policy for a while, but they still, because everybody else is doing it, fall back on the idea that pulp and paper is sort of the way forward in terms of a progressive forest industry. So really what ends up happening with this idea of the client state is that often companies don't even need to ask the government, hey, can you do this for us? The government ends up doing it for them anyway, because that's what they think the sector needs or the sector wants. And it's to a point today that a lot of people are asking, is our forest really ours.com? Well, not the .com part, but the little phrase there, And that's actually a website by the guy named of Charles Tediot in the Miramichi region, if I remember correctly. And in his website, he does a sort of multi-part sort of documentary where he's looking at the issue of who has access to Crown forests, and are they really being managed for the people of New Brunswick, or are they managed for industry? So there's this real sort of political barrier that's deeply tied in with the economic one as well. And finally, while I focus a lot on sort of politics and economy, or as we refer to it, political economy, I want to also just kind of point out for a second a social barrier as well. That, not to say, not trying to take sort of onus from the communities as well in which these mills often exist. Here's a good quote from the report of the Industrial Inquiry Commission on the Pulp and Paper Industry in New Brunswick from 1972. And it's in reference to looking back at what had been occurring for decades. And the quote is, "Pulp and paper mills have been built and encouraged by all elements in the community seeking jobs, profits, and the prosperity which has traditionally been associated with this industry. No thought was given to the effect on the environment. Communities learned to live with the characteristic odors, and rivers appeared to be inexhaustible resources." Right? So there's the idea that in these rural communities, particularly places that have less economic diversity, so if you have one industry, basically, the sort of stereotypical mill town, you then become very protective of the one mill that's still there. The sort of one resource that keeps your family going, that keeps the heritage of the place going, what have you, right? So people will often knew of the sort of environmental effects that might come with having a mill, but they often looked the other way, if you will. So this is also something else that environmentalists, conservationists, people who are trying to engage with these communities had to work through in the past. So I want to move on to a specific case study, some of my own research. This is the New Brunswick Spruce Budworm Spraying Program. Some of you may know the eastern spruce budworm is native to the Northeast Americas here. A couple of inches long, historically appears every 30 to 40 years or so. By the 20th century, when the budworm is starting to appear at sort of epidemic levels, and its usual sort of fluctuations and its usual cycle, of course, by then, by the 1920s or so, the pulp and paper industry was well entrenched within the province, and the exact sorts of trees that the budworm likes to show up and munch on are the sorts of trees that the pulp and paper industry likes to use to make paper. So, all of a sudden we have this little bug and a big industry on a collision course. And there was a major outbreak in the early 1920s, just when pulp and paper were starting to arrive, and then the outbreak again flared up in about the mid-1940s. And a lot of the people who had been alive and around in the 1920s were still alive and around in the 1940s. And there was a real fear of what this little bug was going to do. Now, it's a little bug, but there are millions and billions of them. And then on a grand scale, they can eat a lot of trees and kill a lot of trees that are otherwise merchantable. 1945, the federal government of Canada started a couple of research areas. You see Area 1 and then later Area 2. Area 1 is 1945, Area 2 is the early 1950s. And these were related in terms of trying to discover ways to control the budworm or to deal with it. And part of the research was related to, say, using silviculture, using forest management, things that might have been more in line with, say, the ecological limitations of the sort of mixed forest that exists in New Brunswick, also Maine. But by the early 1950s, the budworm outbreak is at such a great degree, it's gotten so large, that the industry itself is really terrifying. So what they do in 1952, one of the big pulp and paper mills, actually a couple of them, with the provincial government, they form a public-private partnership, a company called Forest Protection Limited, which is actually still around to this day. And they start one of the world's largest and longest sustained aerial spraying programs we've ever seen. They start to create the first sort of runway in the woods that they create is Budworm City in 1952. And what they would do is they would spray in the spring, and try to catch the budworm before it goes to a moth stage later in the summer, before it could flap around and move on to another part of the province, and sort of continue to do the sort of thing that it does with the trees. These sorts of runways eventually appear through all throughout the province, especially in the northern half. What they use to try to control the budworm, diphenodichlorotriphonoxate, something like that. Anyway, I usually have it written up there, so it's better. It allows me to say it all at once. But otherwise known as DDT, the sort of infamous chemical insecticide, pesticide that is used rampantly after the Second World War up until about the late 60s, early 70s in North America. Now, DDT is actually a powder. It's a solid. And when you put it into water, it doesn't mix in, it just kind of floats on the top. So you need to use an emulsifier to kind of suspend it so it can float in the liquid and then be kind of mixed in and then sprayed. So what they preferred to use in the 1950s was burnt oil. And burnt oil would attach itself, and they'd mix it in, and then they'd spray that all over the place, trying to kill all these bugs off. And the sort of language that they often used was very militaristic. This is after the Second World War. A lot of the people who were in the Forest Service, involved with the forest industries, the people who fly these planes, would have served during the Second World War. And in fact, the spray planes that they used in the 1950s, these Stearman biplanes, were the sorts of planes that they used to teach pilots to fly during the Second World War. So this was leftover materials from the Second World War that had been being repurposed for this new war on the bugs. They would often fly in 2 or 3 plane formations and spray the sort of places that the entomologists had mapped out where the bugs are going to be particularly susceptible, or where they're going to maybe move to next, or where they're sort of densest. They used DDT from about 1952 to 1968, and during that period there were points in time when they were spraying a third or up to a half of the province, and in that period, for about 16 years, they sprayed about 65 million liters of this DDT mixture over all of the province, about 17 million gallons or so. So you can just imagine the sort of effects that this might be having on the forests. And DDT gets into the bugs, it's then eaten by fish, it's then eaten by birds. It bioaccumulates as it goes up the chain, and ends up killing a lot of things that people like. The big impact that people notice first is the impact on fish. I'm sure just about everybody in the room has encountered this book before. If you haven't, pick it up. It's a great environmental classic. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And this is often thought of as the book that launched the modern environmental movement. And there's a lot of sort of disparate concerns in the 50s and early 60s of the sort of impact of the post-war economic growth in North American society. And in 1962, as one historian puts it, Silent Spring was like the sort of a lightning rod. Focused all of the concerns that everybody had and made it into one environmental movement. It's a good narrative, it's a little more complicated, but it's the one we'll go with for today. So Rachel Carson wrote this famous book, spread concerns about the indiscriminate use of pesticides around North America, ended up helping create this new environmental movement that's still around to this day in one form or another. And she actually used a lot of the budworm research that had been created in New Brunswick on the landscape since the 1940s, in those federally funded research zones that I showed you earlier. And New Brunswick at this point, because of the budworm research, had really become a resource science powerhouse. And in the mid-1970s, Buzz Holling, who David had talked about earlier, was even referring to New Brunswick having the world's largest continuous set of ecological data, right? And it was all because of their efforts of trying to control this budworm. And the idea of the fish kills, and particularly the salmon that it was killing. Salmon's a very sort of important cultural fish for a lot of different peoples. A lot of wealthy people liked to fish salmon, so wealthy people were paying attention to it, plus the politicians who the wealthy people knew. And she actually, her 9th chapter is called Rivers of Death, and the first third or so of that chapter is describing the sort of fish kills that are happening in the 1950s, the Miramichi River in New Brunswick. So what's occurring in New Brunswick and the impacts that this sort of indiscriminate use of pesticides that's helping to keep the pulp and paper industry going and alive is really getting noticed at an international level. Jump forward a little bit to the later 1960s. There are a number of people, particularly a lot of the sort of scientific and technical community throughout the province, a lot of the sportsmen, a lot of the hunters, the fishermen, those sorts of people who are becoming very concerned about the sort of the spray, but also about water pollution, wildlife management, these sorts of issues. And they all sort of get together and form the province's first environmental organization in 1969. There had been conservation organizations before that, but the first sort of real environmental organization, as we understand it today, was formed in 1969. This is a not very good scan from the newspaper at that time. It's the Conservation Council, but it ends up being kind of very organization-minded. And as I said, a lot of the people who are on the Conservation Council are resource scientists, soil scientists, agrologists, hydrologists, actual entomologists who had worked at one point in time in, say, the spray program. And they have very much sort of this idea of using the CCMB in the early 1970s as sort of an educational outreach platform, but also try to lobby the government, but in a very sort of collaborative approach, right? This is a letter from, a section from a letter Kenneth Lang made, who's president of CCNB in the early 1970s, to a colleague of his. And as he says here, we have had no great confrontations here, but we have met with provincial cabinet ministers and their deputies from time to time, trying to get legislation adopted and enforced. We've had a very low-key cooperative approach to the matter of conservation. I prefer to consider the whole thing as conservation rather than anti-pollution, etc. I believe it is a more positive approach. So Fredericton, the capital of New Brunswick, where the CCMB was based, a lot of these scientists were very well educated. They were good friends often with the politicians at the time. And they tried to use those sort of close connections to try to get into and lobby and sort of inform, if you will, educate the various policymakers and politicians, government officials they could have access to. They did get some things put into place. They had a full-on Department of the Environment by 1975. They get a Pesticides Control Act that's passed. The first time there's any sort of environmental regulatory framework as far as pesticides are concerned in New Brunswick, about 1973. But there's no real it's not really effective. They just do a little bit. And generally, what my approach is in this period, particularly when environmental departments are brand new in the 1970s, is that a lot of governments and government officials, what they're trying to do is put into place a sort of very basic level of environmental regulatory frameworks to sort of appease enough of the people, enough of the concerns, enough of the movement itself, so as to maintain uninterrupted economic activity. This is particularly important in places, or we see it particularly in places like New Brunswick, in which the sort of resource economy, and particularly a resource economy that revolves around one major aspect, to a large degree, forestry, you see that in particular. So what you get is a sort of political inertia. They give a little bit, but not too much. Appease enough of the folks so that they're pleased enough, particularly these, say more, I don't want to say they're more conservative, but these are more moderate environmentalists in the early days of the movement. And the sort of inertia, to give you a good and fun sense of the sort of inertia that's put in place, I want to show you this comic book, Captain Enviro. This is a comic that came out in 1972. Captain Planet came out in 1990, so take that. Canada had it first. So this is put out by the Council of Maritime Premiers in 1972. And the idea, what they're trying to do here, is they're trying to inform kids, usually in about middle school or so, about environmental matters. But they want to do it in a way that counters what they think of in terms of some of the more radical or subversive elements in the environmental movement at the time. But they say that what they often refer to in committee minutes is the scare agenda, right? The radical agenda that comes with some of the environmental movement. The way they do that often is sort of a prioritization of individual actions over real structural change. And what they're trying to do is they're saying, if every single person can do their own little thing, kind of like recycling, which is at the end of the productive process, I'll add that all up, a lot of major change is going to happen. Where some environmentalists, particularly I think today even, would argue that we need some sort of deep-rooted societal change, structural change, if the sort of economic or the sort of environmental damage that we're concerned about, we're going to do something to stem that. And this is the sort of message throughout the comic, is that individual actions are much preferred over any sort of structural change. And here, this is kind of in the middle of the comic, and this is Captain Enviro. Here he is now with all the facts to sort of counter that sort of scare agenda, if you will. And it's all of it you can help save by doing your own sort of individual actions related to each of these. Land, water, and air. By the mid-1970s, the Conservation Council is experiencing a little bit of a lull in terms of fundraising and membership. And there's a real revitalization that occurs by the late 1970s for a number of reasons. But there's also a generational change that occurs. And it's no longer, say, an older generation, resource scientists and the like, who are, say, more moderate, who want a more collaborative approach with government. By the later 70s, you're really starting to see a much more confrontational approach. And this is when the boomers are starting to get, coming out of college, they have a lot of passion. And in particular, there's a new president by 1978, by the name of Dana Silk, who I interviewed back in 2014. And as he says here, spruce budworm got me into a lot of trouble, notably with UNB, the University of New Brunswick, CFS, that's the federal government, and the spraying company, FPL, the sort of public-private company that we were talking about. Although Richard Hatfield, Premier of the province from 1970 to 1987, and I got along quite well, his government was not good for the environment. When he got re-elected for the fourth time in 1982, that can happen in Canada, I had alienated so many people in his government and bureaucracy that I thought it best to move on. And they really take on sort of a more confrontational approach, less trying to work with them, because they'd seen what the older generation had tried to do, and it hadn't really seemed to have worked in terms of actual effective environmental regulations. And what you see here, I'm not going to read all of this, but, and this is kind of passive-aggressive bureaucratic speak of the mid to late 20th century, but this is really coming across as, might seem sort of moderate in tone, but this is kind of a more sort of radical approach, even from the government, in terms of how it deals with the group itself. The obvious difference in our position about the CCMB submission to the Pesticide Advisory Board is one of context, and I believe that further debate between us about the details of the situation would be fruitless. So they're really starting to, sort of, there's a backlash that's occurring because the sort of, the degree to which the CCMB is now sort of lobbying and the way in which they're sort of becoming a bit more confrontational. The Pesticides Advisory Board was this sort of regulatory board that came out of the Pesticide Control Act from the early 70s. And it was sort of a consultative board where the board was supposed to hear from different community members, but it didn't really have any teeth, and it was seen more, again, as just being a way of, okay, you've had a chance to tell your story, we've heard it, we're going to continue spraying. By the end of the 1970s, they still had not done much. And the one issue that finally put them over the top, so that the New Brunswick government had to put something in place, was kids dying. Right? There had been fish kills have been occurring for a while. Once they made the transition, started experimenting with phenetrathion in the early 1960s as a replacement for DDT, and then later Madasil. Those were much more, in terms of, had a greater effect on bird populations, so there were just birds dropping dead in people's front yards. So then people were like, this might be bad. And there were even some concerns after Rachel Carson published her book that it might have effects on people's sort of general genetic makeup, maybe having an effect on cancer or something like that. Concerns were always there. But usually you can get people really riled up when their kids are involved. And by the later 1970s, there was concerns about particularly the emulsifiers that they were using. They're now using not so much the burnt oil, but other chemical emulsifiers to sort of keep these various sprays or chemicals suspended in the water. There's concerns of it being linked with Reye's syndrome, which is sort of a very kind of rare disease. It doesn't really have any sort of perfect number of symptoms or anything like that, but it's often deadly. It's rare, but it's deadly to those who it affects. It particularly affects kids in the brain and the liver, places where a lot of these pesticides can concentrate. And after some kind of well-known in Canada anyway from back then. Studies that were put out that made these linkages to the sort of the poison mists that are being sprayed around New Brunswick. There's a real popular movement that kind of flares up across the province. And it was in that midst of this popular uprising amongst the peoples of the province that the Conservation Council got really aggressive in terms of its approach, because there was real concerns about kids at this point. So kids versus trees, as one person said it. And this is actually sort of a screen capture from CBC Archives. You can go on there today. This is their sort of original story from 1976 that helped popularize the issue. So I want to close today with a few sorts of things, some takeaways from what I've been saying here, kind of, something you can take home, if you will. Structural barriers to environmental engagement are nothing new. It's a history that goes back several decades. So it's perhaps something that's important, in particular, to tell the students, grad students, people who are coming up, got lots of idealism perhaps. This is not to discourage you, but it's to kind of keep sort of reality right in front of you. Types of barriers can be diverse, economic, political, social, as I have mentioned, but those are only some of them. Barriers to engagement can be durable and deep-rooted, likely more difficult to overcome in areas with less economic diversity. Sort of the more in which the economy or the society of a region relies on fewer types of economic pursuits, the harder it's going to be to get some buy-in, if you will. Engagement very well may take long-term commitment, might take a long time. It took decades in New Brunswick in various different approaches of trying to get change of any sort. And I forgot to mention what the governor of New Brunswick finally actually did is in the early 1980s. They never stopped the spray program. They just stopped using straight-up chemical sprays, and they started using BT, which is sort of microbial spray, which is much more of a directed spray at the budworm itself. Doesn't affect all the birds and the fish and everybody else. No easy solutions. I could see it very easily being that creative and imaginative solutions might be needed. And in particular, I think viable economic substitutes will be key. That you'll need something to make it obvious to the people who you're trying to work with that when some sort of regulatory apparatus or some sort of change happens, there's something on the other side of it, right? Because there's these really deep-rooted barriers that are in place. You need to give them something to work towards. All right, I'll end there. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions, but I do want to mention that we've actually reserved some time with Mark in the next room with some students that are sitting in on these talks every week. And if there are other students in the audience who want to join us, feel free to do so. So that'll happen at 4 o'clock.
I should, just to keep the overlords happy, support for this research is provided by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And thanks for listening. We have to do that too.
I think that was great. I gave a not really similar talk, but something about some issues related to Maine last week on the rural economy, particularly around the Katahdin region. So this mirrored it nicely in that perspective. I'm wondering, you talked a lot about crown land and sort of issues around that. That's, like you said, primarily in sort of north central New Brunswick.
Yep.
In your sort of research of that era, I wonder if there's, is there anything of interest that's sort of also evolved in the southern half where there's still private forests, but my guess is that there were still some sort of issues around the private management approaches that perhaps you can expand.
Oh yeah, big time. So a lot of the private land, particularly in the southern part of the province, was under the operation of woodlot owners, and they're a big component of the economy in New Brunswick, even to this day. They have marketing boards in place that certain companies are trying to get around now that were put in place in the early 1980s. And if I remember correctly, I think in the 1960s there was something like 20 or 30,000 woodlot owners in the province who were part of the forestry sector generally. And there was always concerns from the woodlot owners about competition from the public forests themselves. And their sort of complaint was always, why are we having to compete with these large companies, in essence, who can go out and for almost free terms of resource rents, gain access to these public forests and use them almost like if they were own private lands of theirs. Whereas we are actual taxpayers, we are kind of supposed co-owners of these resources. Why are we, as also entrepreneurs, competing with this public resource, right? So they were always there, and they were always part of the sort of debates that occurred right up to the present. But a big issue as well, from the point of view of government, of the state, was a small s state, not like the state of Maine. They were really concerned about people who are using the Crown forests in improper ways, if you will, sort of get their cut and then get back out and sort of use them up in a real fast manner. Clear cut it all when the prices were really good. So you really start to see in about the 1930s, 1940s, efforts to, extension services and that sort of thing, where they're trying to work with the woodlot owners to give them more information, in effect, train them, if you will, in sort of scientific practices about, 10-year rotations, thinning, that sort of stuff. So there's a real sort of effort to try to engage with them as well. Yeah.
You mentioned early on that there was sort of a boom and bust cycle to the budworm, and I'm wondering, is that no longer, like, it seemed like it was maybe when it was kind of on the rise, it became an issue, and it seems to have been a continuous issue since then, and I'm wondering, like, how does that influence both the economics, but also, I mean, right, if it's only a problem for 2 or 3 years at a time, wouldn't it just be cheaper to treat during those 2 or 3 years than be continuously battling this? And I'm wondering if that ever entered the conversation.
Yeah, so there's different, for sure. The kind of the budworm has this 30, 40-year cycle, like I was mentioning. Part of the ways that it's been kept under control, if you will, by natural elements was sort of the mixed hardwood softwood nature. The budworm really prefers the softwoods, but then if you have stands of hardwoods mixed in, there are sort of natural barriers in the way from it kind of moving around too much. Another big component to it was birds. Birds were very much involved in terms of keeping the numbers down. But one of the after effects of the spray that they found is that they were also killing all the birds. So the natural controls, in one sense, were not there anymore. So Buzz Holling does a lot of this sort of work in the 1970s. I'm actually looking at him on another paper. They like to talk about the budworm flares back up in 1945, and then it's really around until about 92 or 93. And they like to talk about it'll disappear for a year or two here and there. And they'll say, oh, there's 3 or 4 kind of fluctuation periods during the 20th century. Probably more of just one mid-level outbreak that never went away. So the amount of money that they try to put into trying to control it through sort of these chemical means is massive in terms of research and everything else. The sort of silvicultural and forest management approach disappears after a while. It's not as popular. It's seen as being, people are still working on it, but just because people are researching it, say in forestry schools or in government research stations, doesn't mean that industry people or policymakers are going to pay attention to it. You can present that to them, but I'm sure as any scientist will tell you, doesn't mean that people in power are going to pay attention to it. So all of this is going on, and then eventually it does come back under control by the early 90s. And it is still there, and it's still a concern, and people are still researching and talking about it. But it's only really been in the last few years. I think it was just in the last year or so that the governor has, here in the state of Maine, has, there's another budworm task force that's been drawn back together, because the budworm's back. It's in eastern Quebec, and it's starting to go into northern New Brunswick. And what the new sort of factor that's happening now from the 1980s or so forward, particularly in New Brunswick and places in Quebec, is the sort of tree plantations that are in place. So even age stands, often, kind of genetically similar. What they've created is super highways for the budworm to just munch its way across the landscape, right? So I think now, more than ever before, the industry is terrified of what's coming. I'm not really sure if they know how they're going to control it. Kind of took their eye off the ball for a while, but the budworm's back. But yeah, you think it was still there, but even a lot of the research that was done in, say, northwestern New Brunswick, that had dried up by the 80s, early 90s. So it wasn't economic imperative anymore at that point in time. Liam?
I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about provincial, federal government interaction in terms of crown land management and where those lines intersect or conflict or cooperate?
Yeah, so the crown lands, there are federal crown lands in New Brunswick, and that relates more to national parks, areas that are used by the military. There's a lot more federal crown lands in other parts of the country. And environmental and resource management is a provincial jurisdiction in Canada, but the feds often play a large role depending on, say for example, if it's waterways, if it's say an international boundary, the feds get involved. If anadromous fish, like salmon, that come from international waters are involved, the feds get involved. So these sorts of things. In terms of forestry in the Crown Lands in New Brunswick, you start to see a big role played by the federal government after about the Second World War, and there's sort of wanting to make sure that the sort of depression years of the pre-war economy don't occur again, and they want to maintain sort of as full employment as possible. So in a place like New Brunswick, where forestry plays such a great role, the feds invest a lot of money in terms of trying to rationalize the industry, get a lot of the sort of inefficient players out as far as they are concerned, try to encourage sort of eventually using federal dollars by the 1960s to try to encourage integration of these various components of the industry, lumber sawmills and pulp and paper, for example. The way it works in New Brunswick, even really to this day, pulp and paper has access to a lot of the wood first. Lumber gets what's left over. At least that's how they see it. In other jurisdictions like British Columbia, the way they do it is lumber gets access first, and what's left over goes to pulp and paper because they can use all the scraps, if you will. So they're trying to get sort of that kind of more rational approach to the industry if they could. But it was really through kind of federal, provincial committees where they were trying to encourage sort of these practices, trying to use federal dollars when they could to try to encourage better management practices. And then sometimes the straight up sort of, the sort of the hammer of the law. When they pass sometimes a federal law that could then supplant provincial law. And in particular, it would be for, like, say, banning DDT by 1970.
I feel like we're in an exercise of he that shall not be named. I wonder to what extent this history is unique in the world because of the domination of a single-family corporation, and how this might have played out if it was a more normal situation, a more diversified set of industry players.
I think the name you're talking about is Irving, probably.
What? I didn't see it.
Yeah, well, I was told earlier that they're taping this. Is there anything that I don't want recorded? No, that's all right. They know who I am. The funny thing is that we often have this practice where the way things are today, we will sometimes think that it was always like it, and then we'll shoot those sort of presentist notions into the past. Irving has always been a player in the industry, but it was never sort of the player until about the 1980s, 90s. So in the period that I really study, you're looking at a number of really large companies. And a number of them, whereas Irving always likes to use the idea, we are New Brunswick grown, and they always use that to try to get the best deals possible from their point of view, from the New Brunswick government, whoever else. There were a number of these companies that, for example, Edmundston, the Fraser Company, they started out as a lumber mill and eventually expanded into pulp and paper. International had been around right from the beginning. Bathurst had started out as a sawmill in the turn of the 20th century and then gone into pulp and paper. So there were lots of companies who also had that sort of cred. And there was a lot of big companies as well, just as large as Irving almost. Irving was always pretty big in terms of they had a lot of private lands, right? So they were always quite a big player in that regard. I think the sort of more unique situation that's appeared over the years, Irving always had quite a bit of power as an individual as well. K.C. Irving, then the Sons. They always like to say that up until about 1960, K.C. had a direct line to the Premier. I don't know if that's true or not. That's what they'd like to say. What's changed now is that, in many regards, Irving has survived everybody else and is still the big player in the landscape. So the degree to which one company has now come to dominate the industry is very different than in the past, and the sort of power that one company does have is very different than in the past. And that can be quite unique as compared to other jurisdictions. But that's really in the last 20 or 30 years.
So I'm mindful that we're kind of at time. I want to remind you that there's probably still a little bit of food. Students, if you want to come join us in room 105 on the right, feel free to do so because we'll have plenty more time to explore some of this with Mark, including the history students if you want to come over. It'd be great. Let's thank Mark again for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.